In creation, we see, again, if we're looking at this from God's point of view, or if we're even looking at it from a human point of view with an openness to the possibility that there could be a God, I think we just are overwhelmed with the reality that not only did God create the world that we live in, but God sustains and directs the world that we live in. We call this idea, and sometimes you may have heard this, it's one of those, have you ever known how like churchy people sometimes use these churchy words, and I don't really know what they mean, but it sounds good, and so I'll say it or whatever, but one of those churchy words is this word called providence. And sometimes you'll see that written with a capital P. And providence, though, actually is just this idea that creation isn't something that God just sort of created and then kind of walked away from, what it sometimes called the clockmaker God. He kind of made this clock, he wound it up, and then he walked off until it ran out needed to be wound back up again. But rather, a God not only creates everything, but sustains everything in being. Really, in a way, is saying that every moment is a moment of creation. God continuing to desire and to will everything that is to be. Because actually, if God didn't want it to be, it wouldn't be anymore. And that's an amazing thing, again, to think about how particular God's love is. It really gets down to the details. God wants everything that is to be. God wants, for example, you to be. He called you out of nothingness into being, and he continues to hold you in being, even when we turn away from him. And so that's what providence is. That's this idea of providence. And that implies to us that there is some rhyme or reason, again, to our lives, that there is some direction to it. St. Paul says about that all is for good for those who love God. Not just some things, not just the things we like, not just the things that make sense to us, but all is for good. And again, that's an understanding of God's providence. It's very interesting that God allows us to have a role to play in that. We have free will. There are certain things in this world that God chooses to allow to be done by us. Now, that's not to mean that God is somehow, his hands are tied by us, but that he has such great confidence in us, he allows us to participate. And we see this over and over and over again in the history of salvation, that God chooses, he prefers to act in the world through human instruments. And again, that's going to come to its perfection in Jesus Christ becoming a man and saving us in his sacred humanity as a man.